Welcome. If you have a bag of chips or snacks, anything noisy, please get them open now before the panel starts so it isn't a distraction. I'm Doug Smits, 3L, Burke Environmental Scholar, and in the Environmental Law Clinic here at Case Western Law. This presentation is a critical review of Department Energy's greenhouse gas emissions on U.S. climate. In 2009, the EPA issued its endangerment finding under the Clean Air Act, concluding that greenhouse gases threatened public health and welfare. The determination was based on scientific evidence of climate change. The finding provided the legal foundation for regulating greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles, power plants, and other sources. Recently, however, the EPA proposed rescinding the finding, arguing that it exceeds the agency's statutory authority and should not serve the basis for wide-reaching climate regulations, and challenging the old science determining the endangerment finding as too pessimistic. The proposal has sparked intense debate over administrative authority, environmental protection, and the future of U.S. climate commitments. The panelists today will discuss the proposal and the future of the 2009 endangerment finding. I'd like to introduce you to our panel, starting with Professor Cyrus Taylor. He's a distinguished professor and dean of physics at Case Western Reserve University, and he has received a PhD from MIT in physics, and recently shifted from particle physics to climate work in 2018, and is a Guggenheim Fellow and American Physical Society Fellow. Next, I'd like to introduce you to former EPA Deputy Administrator Janet McCabe. She was the Deputy Administrator from 2021 to 2024. She worked in the EPA's Office of Air and Radiation during the 2009 endangerment finding, and is now affiliated with Indiana University Law School, their Environmental Resilience Institute, to include several other nonprofit efforts in the environmental advocacy sector. Next, we have Professor Victor Flatt. He's our Associate Director of the Burke Environmental Law Center, national expert on environmental, climate, and energy law, co-author of a leading case book, author of over 60 articles, a recent ethics advisor to the ABA section on environment, energy, and resources. And then last, we have Professor Jonathan Stryer. He's an interim director of the Great Lakes Energy Institute, managing director of the Case Western Reserve's Solar Durability and Lifetime Extension Research Center, and leads data-driven work on the reliability and lifetime of green energy systems. He works to build industry and federal partnerships and runs programs like Think Energy Fellows that encourages energy entrepreneur projects. Thank you for your time and look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Cyrus Taylor, as was introduced, and what I want to talk about is the parallel to the effort to rescind the 2009 finding was a report issued by the Department of Energy designed to undermine the scientific basis for the 2009 finding. Just quick summary of the way it was introduced. 2009, the administrator finds the current and projected concentration of 6 key well-mixed greenhouse gases in the atmosphere threaten the public health and welfare of current and future generations. So it's the goal of the Trump administration to overturn that, and in doing that, at least from the scientific side, they face the fact that the overwhelming understanding of climate science, reinforces the 2009 finding rather than undercuts it. And in particular, sort of the gold standard for assessing periodically where we are in our understanding of climate science is a series of reports put out on about a 6 or 7 year cycle by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The last round of reports that came out from 2021 to 2023 totaled about 7,500 pages, summarizing a much larger scientific literature. And the first of the findings of that, in language negotiated not only by the scientists, but by representatives of each of the 195 nations that actually govern the IPCC, was it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, oceans, and land. Widespread rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, biosphere, and biosphere have occurred, and then it goes on and on. Now, on July 29th, the EPA issued a proposed rule to rescind the 2009 finding. And on the same day, the Department of Energy released a so-called critical review of the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions by a 5-member working group. That DOE report, designed to undermine the science, is about 150 pages long. And my goal in this is to give you a flavor of just sort of what the character of that is and why it's unsuitable as a basis for any policy making. And I should say, if I didn't, I'll return to this a little bit later. As soon as this came out, it was sort of a self-organized group of 80 some odd climate scientists, of whom I were one, that basically decided to issue detailed comments on it as part of the DOE review process. There was a 1 month timeline for it. So in a month, we produced a roughly 450-page document going through sentence by sentence, figure by figure, although only hitting the high points. If we'd had another 2 weeks, it probably would have been twice as long. And if we'd had 2 more weeks after that, it probably would have been twice as long again. So the relationship between the two was noted several times in the EPA finding itself. The 2025 Climate Working Group draft report was provided to the EPA on May 27th and was reviewed and relied upon in formulating this proposal. As a footnote, I'd note that the May 27th draft wasn't released, and to the best of my knowledge, it still hasn't, and so we don't know what differences there might be between what they finally released and the initial version. But I think you'll agree that the final version of that is unsuitable. So the Secretary of Energy, in his effort to assess knowledge on climate change since 2009, and especially since the cutoff of the IPCC report, convened a handpicked panel of 5 well-known climate skeptics. Now, if you're going to try and overturn a basis of science as solid as that of that exists in the area of climate change, a head-on attack saying that it's just wrong and so on, it would be a difficult or indeed impossible road to hoe. So the strategy that they're using is pretty clear from just sort of the titles of 2 of the books that 2 of the CWG members have written. One by Steve Koonin, Unsettled, and the other one, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, by Judith Curry. So the strategy of the report is to try and pick around the edges of what we know about climate science. I should say the IPCC report tries to go through very carefully on all topics of interest and assess what we know and the confidence that we have in what we know and areas where we need to know more. So, if you really want to know what's uncertain and how uncertain it is, the place to go is the IPCC report, not the DOE report. As I said, Steve Koonin in his book, I think captures what clearly was the strategy with the quote, "The impact of human influences on climate is, he claims, too uncertain and very likely too small compared to the daunting amount of change required to actually achieve the goal of eliminating global emissions by, say, 2075. So that's where we came in. As I said, our report, which we released on September 2nd, is about 450 pages long. There is, just to give you sort of the headline statement before I go in and try and give you a flavor of some of the content of it. Our overall conclusion is the CWG report exhibits pervasive problems with misrepresentation, selective citation of the scientific literature, cherry picking of data, and faulty or absent statistics. I want to give you a flavor of some of that without assuming any particular technical knowledge. So I was a member of the group that drafted the response to chapter 3, and I want to focus on what's literally about a page of the report, section 3.1.2, change in atmospheric CO2 since 1958. It's two paragraphs which don't actually have much content beyond the figure itself, so we're going to talk about the figure. So this is their graph of CO2 since 1958, and I've known. Does anyone, if you haven't seen this data before, any response to this? Well, I saw it, and my first reaction is what in the world are they trying to convey here? And so the second thing I did was go down and read the heading, which reads yearly average CO2 emissions from Mauna Loa, and that's wrong. The blue line here is not the yearly average CO2 emissions, it's the monthly average CO2 emissions. Now that's really a small point, but it speaks to, I think, the sloppiness with which they actually compiled this thing. And the way you can tell is, you may not be able to see it from where you are, but it's sort of a zigzag up and down. And the reason that happens is there's a big asymmetry in the amount of land between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere of the globe. And so when the northern hemisphere summer begins, at the steppes of Russia and Canada and so on, plants start to grow and so on and pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so the amount of CO2 actually drops a little bit each year and then comes up, and that's superimposed on the rising CO2 because of the popular content in the air. Now, if you click on the link they helpfully included, you get the way that anyone else would have plotted this figure. Namely like this. And so you go back and ask, what are the choices they made in presenting the figure as it is? So the first thing is the vertical axis, the top third of it is just blank, right? The only purpose of that is to flatten out the curve, to make it look, like a modest change over this period. Then down at the bottom, they've got a green curve and another dash curve that they tell you are the levels of CO2 where two of the major mechanisms by which plants carry out photosynthesis would fail and the plants would die. Well, that's utterly irrelevant to CO2 since 1958. It's utterly irrelevant to CO2 anytime in the foreseeable future. And in fact, CO2 has never been that low since plants evolved those pathways. So this actually is, I think, included in there. They've got a message in another chapter that amounts to saying CO2 is plant food. And the idea I think this is supposed to convey is that if very low levels of CO2 would kill plants, and we're doing fine where we are now, having more would be great. It's not a perfect analogy, but the thing that came to mind immediately when I saw this was kind of like throwing someone into icy water and having them die of hypothermia, and saying, okay, it's fine to go swimming in this return time, so boiling water must be better. The other thing that they have a line there, not run all the way across, it's sort of arrows, which indicates the lowest that CO2 got in the depths of the glaciations over the last 800,000 years. And this data comes from ice cores in Antarctica and Greenland. And I think the idea there is to show that another theme of theirs is that what's happening is just sort of in the framework of natural fluctuations. But they don't show you what is the maximum of the CO2 achieved in the warmest of the interglacials on the same period there, and I'll show you that in a moment, because it would undercut their story. And then the other thing they don't show you is, why start in 1958? Well, one answer is that's when we started daily measurements at Mauna Loa. But the question is why did we start daily measurements at Mauna Loa in 1958? And the reason was because in the mid-1950s, it was realized that very soon CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels, which was growing exponentially and still is, would pass the emissions due to changing land use, like cutting down the Amazon rainforests. And that we were entering a period of unprecedented experiment in terms of what's going to happen to the atmosphere. And that before 1958 didn't exist at the time, but it does now because of the ice cores. And so the upshot was, my colleagues and I decided to recommend that that figure be replaced with this two figures. So the bottom one there is what I just referred to, sort of the orange line that's sort of going across at a low level, is annual CO2 emissions coming from land use change. And the blue is annual CO2 emissions coming from burning fossil fuels. And what you see is it was the late 1950s that the fossil fuels began to dominate. The graph above is a version of what they showed you. The red line going across there, sort of the middle of the graph, is the highest that CO2 concentrations got in the last 805,000 years of the ice core record, until about a century ago when we passed it because of anthropogenic emissions. And what you see there, of course, is the blue line is the exponential growth in CO2 concentration since then. We also proposed, if they want to include the minimum that CO2 was in the coldest of the glaciations, you go ahead and include the maximum you got in the warmest of the interglacials. What you see is that the increase in CO2 concentrations, basically in my lifetime, is almost as great as the greatest between the depths of the ice ages and the highest of the interglacials, which would give line to their suggestion that all of this is sort of within the pattern of natural fluctuations. What we're seeing is over the course of a single lifetime changes into a range we've never seen before, and by magnitude as great as seen in glaciers. So, our conclusions on this were that the report's treatment of atmospheric CO2 omit relevant data. The misleading graphical choices undermine the report's claims of being comprehensive and unbiased, and instead reinforcing a false narrative that downplays the scale of recent atmospheric changes and the degree to which those changes are attributable to human activity. Overall, the DOE CWG report does not meet standards of quality, utility, objectivity, and integrity appropriate for use in supporting policymaking, and indeed, none of these followed the standard guidelines for reports of high scientific impact. So that's sort of a quick summary of one page of the 150 pages, and so we could keep going comparably for I don't know, the next 40 or 50 hours easily if you wanted to. With that, thank you very much.
Shall I just jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Gonna share my screen here. All right. Can you guys see that?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, and I can see you. That's great. All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this program. It's great that that virally or remotely I can pop into a Case Western Law School program from here in Indianapolis. This is a presentation that I prepared for the Environmental Resilience Institute, which is why it's got the header on the bottom, and I could not figure out how to get that off of there. So that just goes to show you I'm not a technical person. Thanks so much to the presentation about the science. It first of all shows us that you have to really pay attention to any graphs and charts and explanations that you see, and have somebody who's actually knowledgeable help you understand what has been said and what has been not said. Let me start with just showing you the neutrality statement that makes clear that I'm speaking on behalf of myself. I'm not presenting views on behalf of Indiana University. So I will try very quickly to cover these things. As was mentioned in the introduction, I was actually at EPA in the Office of Air and Radiation when the endangerment finding was signed by Administrator Jackson. And it was a big, big deal back then, and it's a big, big deal now, as I think we can all tell by the continued coverage of this one particular proposal from EPA. So, so what is the endangerment finding? It's a rule, it's a final rule. It was signed by then Administrator Lisa Jackson under Section 202A1 of the Federal Clean Air Act. That's from the title that has to do with regulating air emissions from motor vehicles. And it found that 6 well-mixed greenhouse gases, including CO2 and 5 other gases, may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. That's the question that's asked by Section 202A1. If she made that finding, which she did, it then became the legal basis for regulating air pollution from motor vehicles, and from there, stationary sources such as fossil fuel fired power plants, oil and gas operations, and other industrial categories. I will say that the endangerment finding was also a massive scientific document. It did not generate new science. It compiled hundreds or thousands of studies on climate science that had been produced and reviewed them and used those to make the endangerment finding. The history, just briefly, started in 1999 when a number of organizations brought a petition to EPA saying, hey, we think that greenhouse gases from motor vehicles are air pollution, endangering public health and welfare. Please make that finding, EPA, and then regulate those emissions. In 2003, EPA denied that petition and said, nope, they're not air pollutants under the Clean Air Act, so we don't have authority to do that. And even if we did, we would decline to grant this petition because we don't think it's the right thing to do. There are international discussions going on. This would interfere with that. There is other work going on in the administration around climate change. This would interfere with that. So as is the case with just about everything EPA does, this was challenged in court and resulted in the famous case of Massachusetts versus EPA. There were 3 key findings in that case. The first big one was whether the plaintiffs even had standing to bring the legal challenge. The nonprofit groups had been joined by Massachusetts and maybe a couple of other states. Massachusetts became the lead plaintiff. And the argument they made to the court was, we're losing coastline in Massachusetts because the sea is rising. And if that is an injury, we don't know what is. And the court decided that that was correct and found that Massachusetts had standing. The court also said greenhouse gases fit well within the Clean Air Act's capacious definition of air pollutant. The Clean Air Act, which was first passed in 1970 and then majorly updated in 1990, is a very forward-looking statute. It reflected that Congress knew that they could not know in 1970 or 1990 what the future air pollution challenges might be. And so it needed to leave the agency with both flexibility but also responsibility to pay attention to changing science so that it could, in fact, protect public health from air pollution, even if that air pollution was not something that somebody envisioned back in 1970. So Supreme Court said yes to that, and it said, EPA, you have to reconsider this petition. We're not going to tell you how to respond to it, but you need to take it more seriously and understand that you do have authority and responsibility to treat these as air pollutants. Whoops, I went backwards. Sorry. Keep in mind the election cycles as I go through this history, because of course we know that different administrations have different priorities and goals with respect to all kinds of issues, climate change being one of them. So in 2009, by the end of the year, EPA had issued this endangerment finding, and be sure that there were scientists at EPA who had been working on this for a long time. But it was a massive effort to pull this together. Like everything else, this was challenged, and the endangerment finding, along with a couple of other things, was upheld in 2012. So what happened next? Well, but sort of by operation of law, once EPA made a finding about greenhouse gases endangering public health and welfare, it was obliged to then set standards for motor vehicles. So during the course of the Obama administration, EPA issued 2 sets of rules for passenger cars. The 2010 ones went through model year 2017. You have to give automakers a significant lead time to actually produce the cars that will meet the standards. And then in 2012, there was a rule that went out further into 2025. We also issued 2 rules setting greenhouse gas standards for medium and heavy duty vehicles. Those are very different from passenger cars. They use different fuels. They're just completely different. There are whole different teams of people at EPA who work on light duty and medium and heavy duty vehicles. Once greenhouse gases became a regulated pollutant, that's a term of art under the Clean Air Act, for motor vehicles, that meant that EPA then had to treat it as a regulated pollutant for other sources of pollution, notably stationary sources that were big emitters of greenhouse gases. So we focused on the largest sources of greenhouse gases in the stationary source inventory, most notably being fossil fuel power plants, burning coal, oil, and natural gas, methane emissions from oil and gas operations. We also issued a landfill rule. Landfills were the next highest source of methane emissions as the waste decomposes. We also made a finding that greenhouse gases from aircraft endanger public health and welfare. Getting all of this done, 8 years sounds like a long time, but I assure you it is not when you're doing major regulations like this. That you know will be challenged and where there's massive industry interest, as there should be. They're the ones that are going to have to comply with them. But we got all that done. And in each rule, the agency said, yep, there's still endangerment here. There's climate change is still an issue, and emissions from these particular sources are still contributing meaningfully. Even though if you look at the global pool, American landfills are a small amount. It is a meaningful contributor to the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions inventory. There were a number of important court decisions that came out, and I won't go through them, but they're linked here if you want to find them. But a key point is that the endangerment finding has never been overturned by a court, and in fact has been explicitly or implicitly affirmed, even when some of the rules that EPA issued in implementation of the endangerment finding were not upheld. The endangerment finding itself was never invalidated. So a variety of things happened during the first Trump administration that reflected a different approach to climate change. During the Biden administration, there was a major effort to update these key industry rules. So we updated the oil and gas industry rules and regulated existing sources for the first time, not just new sources. We updated the greenhouse gas standards for vehicles. We issued new rules for reducing greenhouse gases from fossil-fired power plants. The Clean Power Plan, which had been the signature regulatory provision in the Obama administration, had been overturned through legal appeals. And so we issued a new rule that we felt met the direction that the Supreme Court had given EPA. So now we have this proposal to rescind the endangerment finding, and in the same proposal to rescind, to eliminate the greenhouse gas standards for cars, so they would just totally go away, and what would remain would be the requirements for controlling other pollution from cars, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, and those sorts of things. There were more than 300,000 comments submitted. They were due September 22nd. Just as a historical note, back when we did the endangerment finding, we got 380,000 comments on it. We should expect EPA is working frantically to finalize the rule as speedily as they can. Every administration wants to have rules finalized so that your Justice Department can defend it when it gets challenged, and that's what this administration will want to do. There's talk about whether the government shutdown is going to delay the work. Hard to imagine how it won't delay it to a certain degree, but I expect that the final rule may be significantly already written. EPA is obliged under the Administrative Procedures Act to respond to every relevant comment that they get. That is a huge undertaking. If you do it meticulously, it's a risk on appeal if you have not responded. And so comments like the science comments that you heard a minute ago are going to be highly relevant. Basically, the proposal said a number of things about that justified not changing the determination. Air pollution only refers to pollution with local or regional effects. We know the Clean Air Act talks about international air pollution, so there's arguments to that. New motor vehicles don't contribute meaningfully. This is the age-old argument about if you're only contributing 1% to the global pool, what's the point? The point is that you're contributing 1% to the global pool, and very few things do that. And we have to address these sources, and we can do it in a cost-effective way. Another argument that they make is EPA should have addressed each of the 6 air pollutants individually. There are other situations in which EPA treats a class or multiple pollutants as one, ozone in particular, which has 2 main precursors. So there are responses to all of these, and they have been made in the comments. I'll just show you this, but you've already heard about the science, so I don't need to really spend time on that. The comments that have been submitted address every single one of these issues on the legal side and on the science side. And as I say, a legitimate review and response to those comments would be an extensive activity for EPA to undertake. When and if the rule is finalized, we know there will be legal challenges. But if it is upheld, the rule would likely preclude the US EPA from regulating greenhouse gases under the current Clean Air Act. That is assuming that they base their, the court would base its judgment on some legal argument that EPA is putting forward. This clearly is the administration's goal. They have been pretty explicit about that. So that would mean that Congress would have to pass another law about climate change, or they would have to amend the Clean Air Act to give the EPA more explicit authority in the future. It will also provide the basis for EPA to rescind all of the greenhouse gas regulations that I've talked about. They've already started that process with the mobile source rules, and they've also proposed to change the power plant rule. So I think they will move forward with that work, whether or not, whatever happens to the endangerment finding, but it would definitely provide the legal predicate for them to easily say, oh, we can't do this rule now. Another issue that TBD, what it means is that there are a lot of states, including the one where I live, I'm not sure about Ohio, have state laws that say the state can't issue any environmental regulations that are more stringent than what the federal government requires. So if there is no endangerment finding, no greenhouse gas regulation at the federal level, and not even the possibility of it, I would expect that people would argue that states like mine can't have their own greenhouse gas regulations. And there are a number of states that do have their own greenhouse gas state statutes and regulations. So we will have to see what happens there. There are lots of good resources on this, but I provided a couple of links here if you want to look into it further. And that is my presentation, and I will turn it back to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor McCabe. I'm going to limit my remarks to a few comments to sort of link some issues that have come up that were brought up both by Professor Vance and Professor McCabe. So just some sort of focusing in on some issues that have come up. First, let me say I was part of a group that also did submit comments on this from the Center for Progressive Reform. The first thing I want to mention, and Cyrus didn't have a chance to do this, is that immediately after the creation of the so-called working group for the Department of Energy, that was challenged. It was challenged as violating the Advisory Working Group Act, which requires certain things to happen before any agency can create a particular working group. Based on that legal challenge itself, the working group was disbanded. Department of Energy, before the comment period closed, they just disbanded them and said, okay, they don't exist. Query what happens to their report if they are not constituted correctly, and what does it mean for EPA to rely on that report in an administrative proceeding? Would that be arbitrary and capricious? And what's interesting is even Judith Curry, one of the scientists on the panel, said, oh, DOE really made a mess of this. They should have appointed us correctly, and we can't rely on that. They can't rely on this. I bring that up because it's rumored now that in the final rule, and I believe Professor McCabe is correct, it's going to come out as soon as they possibly can. It is now rumored that they are going to completely drop the scientific justification for the repeal of the endangerment finding. Basically, they are going to say it has nothing to do with science. We're not claiming that, global climate change isn't happening. We're not claiming it's not happening this quickly. We're not disputing the science. It's all there. We agree. Just ignore that man behind the screen. And they are going to base their defense solely on their purported reasoning that the EPA in 2009 did not have the legal authority to find that these greenhouse gases endangered public health and welfare. The first response to that, and a response that many commenters have made, of course, is that this is a sort of a sideways attack on Massachusetts versus EPA, which specifically held that these greenhouse gases are air pollutants under the meaning of the Act. As Professor McCabe pointed out, the EPA set out certain reasons that it should have been read as through local or regional exposure. And let me just read the statute. It says the administrator shall prescribe standards to any air pollutant from any class or classes of new motor vehicles, which in his judgment cause or contribute to air pollution, which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. There's no through local or regional exposure. I think if one looked at the entire history of how our Supreme Court has approached statutory interpretation over 200 years, it's possible that some version of that court, maybe the one that did Griggs versus Duke Power, that really tried to look at the purpose of the statute, one might argue that maybe some greenhouse gases are sort of different and they weren't intending to cover them. But the arguments they're making under current statutory interpretation just have no real basis at all. And that's because statutory interpretation now is textualist. And what they say that caused them to lack authority requires them to add text into a statute where it doesn't exist, which is a clear violation of textualism. And so it can't really mean what they say. I'll just particularly point out that they also said that it needs to be reconsidered in light of the cases Professor McCabe pointed out, West Virginia versus EPA, which overturned the Clean Power Plan rule as an implementation of endangerment finding for power plants, and Loper v. Bright, which got rid of Chevron deference. And what's interesting about those is, of course, in my opinion, they don't have an impact on the original, or even today, even a current reading of the statute, for two reasons. First of all, West Virginia versus EPA is about what you do when you have an endangerment finding, right? It's what powers EPA has to regulate once they've determined that greenhouse gases cause harm. the Supreme Court said they don't have the power to change our energy distribution system and electricity generating system. That is beyond the scope of what Congress would have intended under the Major Questions Doctrine. But clearly, under statute, they are given the power to make endangerment findings, right? That's in fact their chief basis is to make those findings. That's what EPA does. That's how it sets standards. And in terms of Loper versus Bright, getting rid of Chevron deference, we point out in our comments that the majority opinion in Massachusetts versus EPA says they are not relying on Chevron deference. That in fact, EPA, there's no, even if there were Chevron deference, EPA couldn't do it because the statute is clear that greenhouse gases are air pollutants. And in fact, the dissent on air pollution in Massachusetts versus EPA is dependent on and stressed, well, we should be applying Chevron deference and letting EPA not regulate these gases. So Loper Bright basically just takes us back to the original textualism, which is the Supreme Court saying these are air pollutants, and then we have to go on. I'll just stop with that so that you can have a few minutes and then we can have some question time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here. This has been really fascinating so far. I'll just provide some comments on the state of energy right now, how this fits into it, and what that could look like going forward. And I think of this situation sort of in two main ways. One being the broader kind of abstract economic sense, and then what the implications are for the industrial sector and technology, and the physical side of things, I would call it. So one thing that I've seen touted a lot, especially with the press releases about this coming from the administration, are the cost savings to the country, and saying this is going to save $57 billion annually by removing these burdensome regulations. And that's really not that much money. I mean, it's a lot for me and for an institution and an organization. But when you look at just in 2024, the cost of extreme weather events being more than 4 times that, it really ends up being pennies. And the foremost costly years for damage from weather events have been the last 2 decades. And that, assuming you believe the science, is going to be increasing with pretty significant frequency. So I think the cost savings are gonna be lost pretty quickly. We've also, we don't price carbon. There's no carbon pricing structure in the country. That's an expense that's not accounted for. There is, negative health outcomes from air quality and climate that are not necessarily being accounted for in the economics of this situation. And so there's all these downstream implications that really impact this broader economic structure. And how that relates to energy is really on the consumption, the infrastructure, the resiliency side. And so we have a situation now where we have rapidly increasing demand on our grid. It is projected to be increasing really significantly, and I'll pin that and come back to it. But on the basic grid side, the grid is a physical thing. It can be damaged, and when you look at increasing extreme weather events, that is a threat to the grid. It's a threat to restoring power to communities and people, and it's a threat to supply chains, both scaling the grid just to meet demand, but also then to repair the grid rapidly. And we're already pushing those to the max. You can't just buy a gas turbine right now. There's potentially a 4-year lead time on some of those orders. Transformers are increasingly hard to get. So as more extreme weather events are taking parts of the grid offline, the time to restore that power for people is also going to be increasing. And that's going to then have very immediate social implications for people, but also downstream economic implications, because that is whole sectors of the economy being taken offline depending what region is being impacted at that time. So there are a lot of other, I think, parts that are not in the calculus with what we're seeing in terms of the messaging right now. Just to bring it locally, so people aren't familiar, the country is broken up into a series of interconnections. We are in the PJM interconnection. So we are already kind of pushing, again, our grid to the limit. PJM is already predicting that the 26-27 cycle, we could hit that limit. We came really close this past summer, and they're predicting, again, really significant growth. And so what does that look like on the consumer side, it's increased energy prices, which we're seeing. A lot of that is being pinned on AI and data centers right now. That is a really new conversation, kind of in the scheme of things. Even before AI specifically was cited as the driver of our need for increased generation. Broadly, just electrification was also driving this, and general consumer behavior. So we're just sort of at a point now where our consumption is projected to increase, and then we, added AI on top of it, and to be seen if that's a bubble and when it bursts and things like that. But our consumption is increasing regardless, and so that on top of threats from climate, which are increasing, but removing this type of regulatory oversight is going to accelerate that even more rapidly. There's a lot of threat to energy and national security and kind of personal security through that. And I'll relate to the just industrial side really quick. So I mentioned supply chains are kind of maxed out for certain sectors right now. That also is stressed by, again, a lack of investment in renewables. So a lot of energy and technological research is predicated on carbon reduction. That has been sort of a central mode that's been cited for a lot of different types of energy research, whether it's traditional renewables or something like hydrogen. And without this type of regulatory requirement, that justification is invalidated, and then you have to rethink all the messaging around research funding and what you're doing there. And we're seeing that already. Wind is sort of kind of a dead technology for us. You have the federal government revoking siting permits for offshore wind. And then states like Ohio have made it essentially impossible to site wind on land. And so that's very difficult from a regulatory standpoint, which means the investment side isn't there because no one's going to put money behind a project that can't get cited. Solar is more established, so I think you'll still see that exist as an industry. But again, locally, the largest solar producer in the U.S. is First Solar in Toledo. So there are local implications for ripping the bottom out of these industries, and so there are a lot of downstream implications that I think we'll need to deal with. And then I think I'll wrap it there because I can keep going. But thank you.
All right. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask.
Got a little over 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah.
I got one. So I love that you brought up like the downstream costs. And I think it's like interesting that as they've announced this proposal, like it's been kind of pushed out as very pro-industry. Thanks. Very pro-industry. And I think didn't Lee Zeldin like announce it at like a car plant or something like that? Is there any room in the Administrative Procedure Act to challenge them for pretty explicitly considering cost instead of considering human health and welfare, which the Clean Air Act gives them that specific authority to do?
I will say yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's a problem with the regulatory impact analysis. It doesn't consider any of that. So thank you, everyone.